Good morning, everybody. I hope you are hale and hearty and ready to go for another wonderful Workflow Max webinar on this fairly brisk Wednesday morning up here in the northeast of England.
Mm.
Good morning, Liz. How are you?
Morning, I'm all right. It's a bit windswept, but not too bad.
Yes.
Well, yes, no frost, but yeah, strong winds today.
Been running with the dog again, I hear.
Yes, we went out early today.
Very
Mr.
good.
Flappy Ears had his ears out like this most of the run. That's quite comical. Even he thought it was comical. He looked at me as if to say, "What's going on with my ears?"
I love it. I have an image. I really do.
Mm.
So yes, as everybody jumps onto the webinar, and we'll give people a couple of minutes to get in. You are once again joined by your dream team of Liz Tobin from Ginger Snap Consulting and myself, David Oliver from Valued Academy. So today we are talking about Xero integration, and it is pretty simple to do, but at the same time, it's quite a broad topic. There's quite a lot to
Mm.
cover. This is not just a 5-minute webinar. This will still be sort of your 45, 50 minutes that it normally is. And we normally go slightly over with questions, but we'll see. But yes, we've got a fair bit of ground to cover. So we'll see how that goes. But we'll give everybody another minute or so to jump on, and then we'll make a start. So we'll have a quick look at the session plan for today. So literally, these are the areas that we're going to cover, starting with the concept of what is sent from Xero to Workflow Max and what is not sent to Xero from Workflow Max. And we'll be able to see exactly how that operates and how we put that together. Again, we'll work through that, what is sent from Workflow Max to Workflow Max from Xero. I will get that the right way around. It's being the premium level functions. So we'll go into the details of these in due course. Not all of it premium. A lot of it is just the basics that comes back to Workflow Max when you enable the integration to begin with. And we'll see that as well. Yeah, items that are not sent to Workflow Max from Xero, it's good to know. I don't think it's
Mm.
hugely impactful. I think as long as you're aware of the limitations of this
Yeah.
integration, then it won't be too much of an issue for you. And then, as we said, we'll look at the setup details itself. So really, that's the kind of the nitty gritty of how you go about setting it up. So we'll see about that. But yeah, I think we're pretty
Mm.
much ready to kick off there at this point. So we'll see
When
how we
we were
go.
putting this together, we thought, oh, there's not too much to say on this topic, but there's actually
Ah,
quite a lot there. And
yeah.
if you can set up workflow properly to Xero with all the bits and pieces, it does make your life a lot easier, doesn't it?
It really does. And exactly
Mm.
as you said, I mean, this is where the setup is essentially layered. So you can have it basic if
Mm.
you,
Mm.
or you can have it more complex if you prefer to add in a lot of overrides, which they're not hard to do. It's just a matter of choosing and deciding what will work best for you as a business. So
Yeah.
we'll have a look at that when we get down to the setup section. From there, Liz is going to then give you a bit of a guided tour about the ideas of invoicing and how that interacts with the integration, purchase order receipts, so your bills as you add those to your purchase orders and what happens in Xero with those. The payment side of things, so when you add payments either within Workflow Max or within Xero, and then what exactly happens. Some common troubleshooting issues, a few questions that you will come up against, undoubtedly, purely because, it's a piece of software and things happen. And then that concept, once again, of the premium features and where the differences lie with a premium account as opposed to a standard account. So, yeah, we will see what we've got from there. So, coming back to the top, let's have a look. So, what is sent to Xero from Workflow Max? Well, the list is there on screen for us to see. So, clients accept email addresses, and that's an interesting one that we'll circle back to. Supplier details, purchase invoices, sales invoices, and then payments. So all sorts of information there that can populate your Xero with your up-to-date activity. And that's what we need. If we come back to Workflow Max itself, how do we access the integration? Well, we go into business and unsurprisingly into settings. Every bit that you set up is in settings, just about. And within there, we then want to look at the tabs at the top, and you've got your integration tab. Before we go too far into that, just for reference, and we will circle back to this, I want to show you where we've got, and I think I've just gone past it. Actually, there it is, financial. Notice the taxes. We've got a couple of tax types in there. That's it. All right, so nothing more at this point. We'll see that change once we've enabled the integration with Xero. So within your integrations tab, you do have your Xero section right there. And we'll be going into that integration setup in just a moment. Coming back to what we've got here, again, I'm going to open these others up as well. So what items are not sent to Xero from Workflow Max? Well, purchase orders themselves, they do not sync with the purchase orders in Xero. So if you're raising purchase orders in Workflow Max and then wondering why aren't these in Xero, it's because they do not sync. They do not come through. Job costs, so literally cost items in terms of those that you record against your jobs, that is not what actually syncs with Xero. It is the purchase invoice that syncs. So essentially, not the cost, but the bill that you add against your purchase order is what syncs with Xero. And then work in progress. So those figures in Workflow Max that say this is all of your unbilled items, there is no journal, nothing that will pass across into Xero itself from Workflow Max to update your P&L or your balance sheet to say this is our figure for unrealized income, or however you want to describe it. So that again does not come through. What is sent to Workflow Max from Xero? Okay. Invoice numbers, absolutely. Depending upon the settings that we'll see in the integration shortly, we can choose to use Xero's numbering sequence for invoices. So yes, indeed, it can provide invoice numbers to Workflow Max. Tax rates. I showed you the tax rates before for a reason. These will automatically sync with Workflow Max. So they will be pulled through from Xero and literally copied in your system. Tracking categories. So again, this is when we're talking about the layers of integration. There is the ability to include tracking information in various sections of Workflow Max that it will then feed through into Xero. Your
very popular bit of Xero, isn't it? Tracking categories, heavily
tracking
used.
is just it is really, really used. And I know this isn't a Xero, but you know, tracking categories are so beneficial from a reporting point of view. Yes, you've got your account codes, your nominal codes. You've got your ability to report on those. You can group those together in certain reports like your P&L, but tracking gives you just those extra layers of reporting that give you what you need. They're not configured. They're up to you to decide what you want to use them for. So is it a department reference? Is it a list of salespeople? Is it a list of client grades or geographical
Types
areas?
of job,
All
service
sorts. You can do
lines.
absolutely anything. Let alone, which Xero would say you shouldn't do, using them as job numbers, which again,
Well, many people
another
do
time.
that.
Yes, well, heaven forbid that anybody uses it as job numbers. Sales invoice payments. So again, yes, absolutely. If you add a payment in Xero against an invoice, it will actually now transfer up against your invoice in Workflow Max, which it didn't used to be on the platform. So if we've got any good old soldiers from the old days, then absolutely that never happened in the old system. It does in the new one. And we'll probably see that today at some point as well. Lump sum sales invoices, again, premium only. Absolutely. If you raise an invoice in Xero, if you have a premium account, then depending on the circumstances of your integration, it will or should come up against your relevant job in Workflow Max. There are various catch-alls where it can actually create an ad hoc job for you in Workflow Max, if that's the case. But generally speaking, in the standard, this wouldn't happen. If you do need to take advantage of that, and we're talking about things where you've got the idea of recurring invoices in Xero, you've got maybe retainers that you routinely send out to your clients every month, then this idea of the lump sum invoice absolutely becomes really beneficial. A big time saver as well. And again, I think we've just reiterated their sales invoice payments. Yep, not to worry. This is the interesting one. What are not sent to Workflow Max from Xero? So supplier bills. So we can't enter a Xero and expect that to then populate against a purchase order in Workflow Max. Remember, there is no connection between purchase orders from Workflow Max to Xero. So that just doesn't work. Bills created via Xero expenses. ultimately it's the same situation. It's the idea that it's a bill in Xero. So it doesn't matter where it came from to land in Xero, it's still a bill. So it does not come across.
Yet.
Spend money. Yet, ooh, there's a word,
Yes.
Liz. Tell me,
Oh,
do you know?
I don't know. I've heard on the grapevine this is a heavily requested thing. So,
Yeah,
hopefully that will be there
I've got to
one
admit, you're
day.
not wrong. This is where already there are improvements in this integration over and above what we had with the old Xero owned product. So
Mm.
that go figure, Xero, we now have a better integration than Xero themselves had with their own product. Okay.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, it's absolutely true. This is not the end of the story. This will change, this will evolve, this will improve as the months and years roll by. So this is something that we are very much looking forward to seeing what the team decide to do with this, because yeah, there's a lot of potential there. The last item here, in a very similar vein, is that idea of spend money transactions. So literally, if you are spending any money via Xero that does not involve a bill, and again, do not anticipate that that will come into Xero, into Workflow Max rather. So again, we'll talk about yet. I don't think that ultimately will, certainly not for a very long time. But yeah, today, do not worry about these items. You will not see them. So setup, configuring the connection. Well, let's just transfer back into the product and have a look. So you saw me get to this through business and settings, and all I've done is click on the integrations tab at the top of the settings page. If I now click into set up your integration, you can also click on learn more if you want to find out a little bit more about it. But here we are. It's now looking at my very long list of Xero entities. This is why yours would not take that sort of length of time to find. I've already got a couple of organizations connected. You would normally either click into the drop down, or if you've only got one organization, it would list your name already there. And you can see what it's asking for in terms of various pieces of information. If I was to clicking on continue, I should be able to pick up. Watch this go wrong, Liz. Let's see how we get to.
Don't
So
jinx
yeah,
yourself. Yes, it's gone wrong.
yeah, cancel back. Come on.
I
Yeah,
thought you were
let's try.
quite brave switching it off before a webinar.
Well, it's let's just go around the houses again, business and settings. Let's try it one
You
more
like to
time.
live on the edge, don't you?
It's let's do this live because it sounds like a good
Yeah.
idea. As soon as you say the word live, it's like the universe is listening. So let's just see what we've got. Well, here we are. If I go into valued demo, there it is. So click on allow access. This will take us through to the next screen. And here we can pick up value demo again. And when we click on next, you can see you've got your little timeline or track at the top that we're going through. And here is your initial configuration. So these are your basic settings that we need to put in place. First of all, you can see the little asterisk denoting this is a compulsory setting. I'm going to take a small drink of water. I beg your pardon. So
Been
here,
poorly, haven't you?
pardon?
You've been
Oh,
poorly, haven't
full of cold. So again,
you?
croaky, full of you don't need to know. It's not very pleasant, but it's nearly done. So
Yeah.
in terms of the account code, this is any sales account that you've got listed. So if you've got it as a revenue account in Xero, if you wondered what your accounts are, here's your Xero. If you go into accounting, go to your chart of accounts, you'll be able to see that you've got this broken down into a series of types of account. So when it comes up, come on Xero, you can do it. Thank you. So here you can see that you've got revenue. So if I click into revenue, you can see my revenue codes there. Funnily enough, it's the exact same list that we've got here. So I'm going to choose sales type A, and then I need to choose a tax on sales. So here I'm going to say, and please get this right. One of the biggest problems that you have is if you get this wrong. 20% VAT on income. Bear in mind, I'm in the UK. If you're elsewhere in the world, you will have different taxes. The same is true for cost of sales. So again, looking at my expense codes. So I'm going to choose cost of goods. I'm going to choose VAT on expenses. So again, make sure that we've got those right. So for sales, it's income. For costs, it's expenses. Tracking categories. Do I really need to know at a default level that I want to put this to a specific person for
Mm.
my sales or a specific project number? Not really. I mean, they're there. You could use them, but this is your default setting. So unless you've got something that I know maybe you've got a default department that you always use, I can't really see where you would benefit from this. So just bear that in mind.
Mm.
Looking at what we've then got underneath that, in terms of updating client and supplier records, what do we want to do? Do we never want to pass it through to Xero? Absolute rubbish. Of course we do. Do you only want to do it when uploading invoices? Maybe. I see absolutely no issue with you saying every time a client or supplier details are updated. And that just means that
That's
there's
the one. If you wanted to go over it almost immediately, isn't it? After literally you've just set the client up and you wanted to go over.
absolutely
I would use
no. I
that
mean,
setting all the time.
I would agree. I would absolutely
Mm.
agree. I think there's no reason not to choose that. So
Mm.
again, I'm willing to hear other opinions, but I'm totally on your side with that one, Liz. This is the one that I would say take very carefully. Contact person. Update the contact person and email uploading in when uploading invoices. This, and it does give you an explanation here for a very good reason. What that is referring to, if I go into any contact in Xero, so if I just open up my contact list in my demo, and if I just go into Tyne Villas, I think I've got a contact in there. So if I edit this record, you will see I have a primary contact. So Anna de Armas is my primary contact here, and I don't have an email address. Excuse me. And I don't have an email address for her. So all that would happen if I have this setting in place is anytime I add a new contact to my client in Xero, it will overwrite this primary contact. I don't
In
want
workflow,
that.
you mean?
Sorry.
In workflow, when you add a contact to your client.
Yes, in workflow. If I add a contact to my client in workflow, if this setting is in place, it will overwrite in Xero this primary contact. And I don't want that. This is probably my billing contact. So this
Yeah.
is the person I need to be sending the invoices to. So if I've got this selected, I just need to be very, very aware of that. Usually I would leave that off and we'll see what we've got.
Mm.
At the same time, yes, this is, and again, a very good point in the chat there. The
Mm.
email address on a client or a supplier record doesn't actually sync with this record in Xero because the email addresses all relate to the person, not the actual client itself. So if this is a company, we can have an email address against the company in Workflow Max. We can have, sales at or info at. What Xero is looking for is Bob at or Tracy at. It's looking at the individual people's email addresses. So again, I know it might be a little bit of manual entry to change that email address when it happens or add it in. It just safeguards you a little bit. So best practice advice, possibly don't tick that box. So when we click next, we're now talking about how we deal with invoices. So approved invoices in Workflow Max will automatically be sent to Xero. What do we want to do with them? Do we want to send them through as approved invoices? You can do. I would say that's fine if you're only raising invoices within Workflow Max. I personally think it's quite useful to have a checkpoint and bring these through as drafts in Xero. If you are raising invoices in both systems for different reasons, at least you can see that the ones that have been raised in draft have come from Workflow Max. So it's quite easy to
Mm.
see. At the same time, we're going to talk about invoicing numbers and sequences in a moment. In terms of the invoice numbering sequence, here we go. We've got it set right now to use Workflow Max's numbering sequence, which is fine if we wish. But what that will mean is that we will then potentially have two different sets of invoice numbers appear in Xero, the ones from Workflow Max and anything that you've raised in Xero itself. What we mainly want to do is avoid the duplication or the replication of Xero's numbering sequence verbatim, literally. So if Xero says that my next invoice is going to be INV123, we do not want Workflow Max to say, oh, my next invoice number is going to be INV123. And that's to avoid certain problems that can occur. If you end up with a situation where the invoice number already exists in Xero, Workflow Max is going to have a conniption. It's basically going to say, okay, I have to do something about this, otherwise I can't send the invoice to Xero. So we'll talk about that in troubleshooting later, but basically you want those to be different if you're using Workflow Max's numbering sequence. In a lot of cases, it's perfectly fine to say, I want to use Xero's numbering sequence. And that is fine. If you want to do that, please do. There's not really an issue with that. It's just going to make sure that it's then looking at Xero to bring those invoice numbers into your Workflow Max invoice. Invoice description. So this is now what information do we want to include in the invoice when it goes across to Xero. So do I want to include the invoice description? This is the separate description that we can add to a unique invoice. And then we've got this idea of what content do we want the invoice to include? Do we want it to include details of each task and cost line that appears in the invoice? Do we want it just to show, and you can see my options underneath change as I do this, just a one-liner saying this is an invoice and this is the one-line header detail that I've got, in which case it will look at this information here to say what it's populating with? Or do I want to include phases? So again, not individual line items, but phases within invoices. You made a very good point about this the other day, Liz, is that what happens if you don't use phases? At least not in all your jobs. So there, be careful with that.
It's a shame you can't override it at the point of invoice, isn't it? To say for this one, yes, we'll send phases. Yeah.
That would be a nice one, wouldn't it? Oh, there you go. Sorry, Chris. Hope you're listening. In terms of most common option, I would say individual tasks and costs are probably by far the most common selection in this section. You can include a message line in your invoice. So again, when it hits Xero, you could have, for example, details of the job name. You could have details of the job description. You could have details of the job number if you wanted to. If I put it there, why not? You can do all sorts with this. This is a free text box, so I can literally type job, NO. I can say, and then hyphen, and I can put my details, something like that. I can put that on the line below. You can do whatever you want in terms of this. You can see we can also include things like the contact name, the client name. We can put, well, the client name technically is already part of your invoice, so why you would want to put that in the line here, I don't know, but you could. And we can see that you can also then, if we are dealing with individual tasks and costs, you can add further information in. So do you want the description, if there is one, on individual tasks? Likewise, on the cost lines, the notes that you might have put on those costs. Let's see what that does. Likewise, you can see if we've got any tasks showing with a zero value, do you still want to transfer those through as part of your invoice? Maybe you do. Not as commonly selected, but you could. And the same is true for costs as well.
I think it's quite useful if you want to demonstrate that you actually aren't charging for something that you have done or consumed.
Exactly right. So if it says that, you know, this is part of what we're offering you or giving you, but we're not charging you for, at least people see where the value is coming from. Cool.
Yeah.
And then invoice payments. Again, I don't see why you would ever not tick this, but do you want automatically to bring payments from Xero into Workflow Max against the relevant invoice? Of course you do. It just automates the process. So as we move forward, we're then looking at the purchase side of things. So a very similar set of questions. So again, in terms of how we want those bills to pass through into Xero, are they going to come through as approved bills? Excuse me.
Or you can send them over as drafts.
Sorry. So yes, approved bills or as drafts. Absolutely. Again, I would tend to suggest drafts. Do we want to include the purchase order details line? Can be quite useful. Rather like the invoice description, it just gives you an extra little something that you can bring through into your invoice. And then from there, what other placeholders do we want to include? So same things again. Do we want to have, try and get it with both brackets, the job number? Do we want to have the job name? And you can see that we've got purchase order numbers as well, all sorts of information like that. But again, if you're happy with what you've got in there, next, and we move through. Excuse me.
The last bit is refers only to Xero Premium. So if you're not using Xero Premium, you can leave the screen literally as is. If you're using Premium and you're creating your invoices in Xero and you want to pull them across and tag them to your jobs, then you're going to tick the box, automatically import invoices from Xero. Are you back?
I am. Thank you.
Nearly done.
Tell you, fun games. So if we do select that, then it is very much worth reading through the details that it's presenting to you here. The settings underneath then become quite critical because it depends on what you set up here as to what will happen with invoices when they're brought into Workflow Max. So for example, if we leave it where it just says automatically import invoices from Xero, if there is no matching job number or client order number in the reference field of your Xero invoice, then it simply will not come through. It just won't appear, or it'll come through, but it'll be a miscellaneous invoice. It won't appear against the job in question.
Yeah,
If we
two
say
things have to match. It's the client and that reference field, isn't it? And that's
absolutely,
without those two things, it fails.
yeah, it just doesn't work. If we tick the box to say, well, I want to create a new job when no current job matches the Xero reference, well, that says, okay, we've got a reference. So if we have a reference, then I want you to create the job. It says for all jobs. Here it says exclude jobs where there is no reference. So if I select that, as long as there is a reference, it'll create the job if it can't find one. There's no reference. Once again, we end up with a miscellaneous invoice. So depends what you want to do. I would possibly suggest that's a good idea. That it's still okay, but that will create a lot of jobs, especially if you find that, you've got quite a number of invoices with no reference. You'll end up with a lot of ad hoc jobs with just an invoice sitting on them.
Yeah.
Again, after that, do you want to add any sort of invoice summary? So something like imported from Xero. And that, again, fairly standard sort of situation. And from there, we can click on complete the setup. Now, bearing in mind that last page, as Liz said, just if you're using premium. So at that point, our basic settings are in place. If I go back to my business and settings, let's just have a look at those tax codes that we had, or tax rates that we had before. So in my organization settings, ooh, look at that. Notice that before I only had the top two. Now I've got a whole host of them. I also can't edit them anymore. While I had
You
this,
you can't remove them from workflow because sometimes there's a whole bunch of tax rates that you will never use on a job, but it's a
it's
mirror
true.
of Xero.
Yeah.
So
I mean, you can go and modify your tax rates in Xero if you wish to, but do that very much under advisement and preferably once you've spoken to your accountant. I would certainly say this does always mirror what you've got in there.
yeah.
If you're in any doubt, you can always come into now. Where was the resync? Wasn't there a resync option?
Yeah, go to the integration page.
Yeah, that was it, wasn't it? It was under there.
Yeah.
So if I have made changes within Xero, so if I've set up, for example, new tax codes, or if I've set up new tracking categories, for example, I can click on to sync option with Xero, and it will have a good old think about it. And then it will come back and say that it has successfully updated the details. So that's everything that you would need to know in terms of that. But yeah, so your basic settings are now in place. They've updated what they need to in Workflow Max, and you're pretty much ready to go. But that is not everything. And again, I'm keenly aware of time, so I'm going to try and be as brief as I can about this, but still give you what you need, is that we now have levels of override that we can apply to this. What this integration is telling us so far is that if I send an invoice through to Xero, it will always go to this sales code. If I send a bill from my purchase order through to Xero, it will always go to this cost of sale code. I might not want that. Now I can obviously manually edit that in Xero if I wish to. It won't harm anything. But what else could I do to automate this going to the right place? The first thing is under job settings. Within job settings, I have job categories. A job category allows me to not only state which overriding income account and cost of sale account I want this to go to. So there we go. I've got different ones there. I can save those changes and that's fine. I can also change or add my tracking information as well. Now, what that would mean is that in the case of any job that's under gardening, whenever I raise a bill or an invoice through Workflow Max, when it hits Xero, it will ignore my default setting and it will use these settings in preference. So that's what it will do. So that is my first level of override. My second level of override is actually split. It's split between tasks and costs. If I go into tasks, I've got, you can also see
Probably
counting
worth
in.
mentioning on the categories, isn't it? That you don't have to use all
Yeah,
those overrides. So I would typically see the category mapped to a sales code, but the cost of sale code not mapped, because it could be that you have lots of different types of bills and you don't want them all stuck under one cost of sale. So you don't have to, likewise, you don't have to use the tracking categories.
I think that's really good advice, actually, in terms of that one, Liz. I think certainly, you're quite right. In terms of what the work is that we're doing, there might be a standard sort of sales code that we're putting it to, because that's how we're analyzing our sales. But in terms of what
Mm,
you're purchasing to do that work, it could be anything. Could be absolutely
mm,
anything.
yeah.
So looking at the task list that we've got, you can see between uh, cat job categories and task list, we do have an accounting interface tab here as well. We'll have a look at that in just a moment. But if I was to go into any task, so if I go into accounting, I can see here that I've got the basic details of what it is. But again, at the bottom, I've also got my income account. So here I could choose consultancy revenue, for example. Notice that it does not have a cost of sale account. That is because tasks are considered to be performed by employees. So your cost for your employees is generally taken care of through your wages. Now, there in the future will potentially be the possibility of Workflow Max exporting to Xero payroll. So when that happens, there will be a totally different element to the integration, which will deal with time, which will deal with rates, etc. But in terms of tasks right now, it's just that income account. Likewise, we again have our tracking options. So again, whatever your tracking is, it can be fed through at a task level. I did mention about the accounting interface tab. What we will see is that rather than having to go into individual tasks to set something, I have a
Mm.
list. So what I can do is I could select a bunch of items, whatever that might be. I can then say, I want to allocate those. What account do I want to put them to? Consultancy. What tracking options do I want to use? And when I allocate, it will do exactly that. So you can see that it's now showing you what's allocated. You've also got the tabs to show what is and what is not already allocated. So if you want to just see the ones that don't have something, click on unallocated. Makes it very, very easy to set this up in bulk. And the same is true for costs as well. So again, if I go into my costs, if I go into any single cost, I've got that same set of options. So there we go. I've got, if I'm selling it, it might be something else. But at the same time underneath, I also do have my cost of sale. And this is because when we have a bill against a purchase order, it will be relevant to a specific cost. So again, looking at that, I can then say when this transfers across, here is what I might want to put it to. So this was travel, let's say. Where are we? Travel national. There we go. And
Yeah.
likewise, I could have my categories in there as well. So those tracking categories, absolutely. The same is
Mm.
also true for my tax rates. So bearing in mind, if this is not vatable, I could say that it might be an exempt expense. Or if it's at a reduced rate VAT, I can say that it's at
Yeah.
whatever rate it needs to be. So again, bear that in mind as well when you are setting these items up. So
Mm.
it's all
On
controllable.
this, yeah, on the sales code, it's probably, I often get asked, why would I want a sales code on a cost item? And it's because if you're on charging specific elements in your job, if you're on charging mileage, accommodation, if you're on charging hire of equipment, so those will go into a sales invoice. So that's why you would want possibly a different sales code.
Absolutely true, because you might not necessarily want those additional expenses to be going to the same figure as your
Mm,
consultants, whatever it might
yeah.
be. So absolutely. You've got that same accounting interface, that same ID replies. You can see that we've got things that are already allocated and others that are not. So very, very easy for us to manage that in bulk. So
Mm.
absolutely, in terms of what we've got there, bear that in mind in terms of those configurations that you can include.
I think when you put the right overrides in place, you just make sure that Xero is exactly how you had it before you started with Workflow Max, and it's not, what's the phrase, the tail wagging the dog, or something like that. Or
You're
because
not wrong.
Xero has to be kept shipshape, and people don't like it when things drop into the wrong nominals, and they don't like it when their P&L is messed up. So, yeah, you
A lot of
when you're
questions
in,
about that. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So when you're implementing workflow, you usually look at your profit and loss and say, right, how do I want this to appear? Now I'll go and do my overrides in workflow to make it
Right.
happen.
I
Yeah.
think at that point, it is worth mentioning, just for clarity, that where it says cost code against our cost items, that is
Mm,
not the account code. The account code
yeah.
is the bit at the bottom there which states the cost of sale or the cost or the income account. The cost code is more like a part number. So that's a reference for this item itself, so that you can see that you've selected the right item from the list, for example. So again,
Yeah.
just bear that in mind, and you won't go far wrong in terms of that.
Mhm.
Um,
And the
so yes,
idea
it
also behind these codes is that the person working in Workflow Max does not need to have any knowledge of Xero and what goes on. As far as they're concerned, they put mileage into an invoice. They don't care where it goes, but behind the scenes, we've made sure it gets tucked away in our mileage nominal code. So,
perfect way to put it. Absolutely. Yes, indeed. Because it is not the case that if people are adding these items into Xero, that they would have necessarily any access to, sorry, into Workflow Max, that they would have any
yeah,
access to Xero. Oh, they don't need it
yeah.
necessarily. So yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. And with that, we have our integration in place. So literally, as we raise invoices, add our bills, all of this information that we've already built will be utilized to determine, okay, does it come through as a draft or an approved invoice? Does it come through to the right sales category, to the right account code, etc., etc., etc. So all of that work that you've done here will pay dividends as you then move forward in the system. At that point, I will hand over to Liz and we are going to have a look at invoicing onwards. So I'll just knock off my
Okay,
screen share there, Liz.
thank you. So I get to do the troubleshooting. Now you've set it up all okay.
So hopefully we'll see, but I know that your data is as good as mine in terms of your prep. So yes, absolutely.
Good. Let's start with invoicing because I think that is the single point of Workflow Max integration that I certainly get most questions on. So if I go and find my job, let's use 241. So we know that when we create an invoice, we save as a draft. It's not at that point that it goes to Xero. Let's do a progress invoice. So it's the moment, obviously, that we approve our invoice. So if I just do a quick quoted invoice, let's just do a bit of my first phase. Let's just do £500. So that's my
There's no
project
bulk
management
deselect
item.
on this one, actually. That's an interesting point to make, Liz. While we can bulk select to remove items on the left-hand side, we can't bulk select to say that we're, oh, have you got that there? Ah,
Look,
how have I
this is
missed that?
new. No, this
When
is
did
new.
that?
I need to tell some clients about this because
Yeah, I was
they've
about to
been
say,
waiting for that.
that's, hey, you saw it here
Yeah.
first, folks.
Yes, you did. You see, live webinar, we get to discover the product. What more do you want? Right, there's my invoice. What am I doing? 500 on that. Oh, that's not pulling me anything up. Maybe it was our checkbox. You see, this always happens to me.
Why is it not doing it? Oh, it's in white. Let's have a look. It was in grey
Yeah.
before. It's thinking about saving the draft.
Well,
Try
let's not
refreshing
use
your
that
screen.
button.
Yeah, just try refreshing. Sure, it had a total in when you first went in.
It did, yeah. It was after unticking. There we
There
are.
we go. So
There
that's
we are,
better.
folks. Sorry about that. Right. So there's my 500 at the point that I approve, save and approve. Off that goes to Xero. So if I've got my demo account here, it's logged me out.
Ah, typical.
I will,
Joys of two-factor authentication.
I will briefly stop my share a second because we were on our other bit of the webinar, wasn't it?
It's
Let me
just
just
Xero
log
being
in
security conscious. We'll forgive them.
because
That's
I'm
why
not
we're
sure
waiting.
where
I
it
forgot
was.
to mention our wonderful colleagues from Workflow Max. So Linnell
You
and Kaya,
did,
you're
yeah.
around answering questions. Apologies. I should have mentioned you right at the start.
There we are. So invoice 1052, and that is for Acme. So that I send everything over as a draft. There he is, 1502, and linked to what you were saying, it will pop it into the nominal code that I have allocated. So there's my 200 sales account.
Oh, look, you've got a message line as well, Liz.
Wow, would you believe it? So that's the point at which it goes over to Xero. I would then approve that. Now, at this point, I can choose to allocate my payment in Xero, or I can do it in workflow. So it doesn't matter which way I do it, they will both end up in Workflow Max. So if I now go, I'm going to do it the Workflow Max way because weren't able to do this before.
Yes.
I can say, yep, I have a payment, 600, and I can say which account that it was paid into. If I have a reference number, I can do. And then that payment should be almost automatic over to here if I refresh there.
It is very quick. It is. Likewise with
Yeah.
items going in now as well.
There we are. So there's my
There we go.
payment. So I can do it either way, which is quite handy because you may have a business process where the person allocating the payments doesn't have access to Xero. So you can then do that in workflow.
Allocating
I'm
them in
using,
Xero overnight sweep, didn't it, Liz?
yeah, it used to be, didn't it? Now it's, I don't know, 5 seconds or so it comes back, which is quite nice.
Very, very quick. Yeah.
So my invoice number, INV 1502, I'm using the Xero numbering sequence that David touched on. I suppose we need to look at that. So I'm asking Workflow Max to grab an invoice number from Xero each time an invoice is approved. So there we are, that's my Xero. What I would say is if I go back to my settings, go to my general settings, if I do edit number sequences, so I always keep my Workflow Max numbering completely different so that if I have an invoice that still has the Workflow Max number, it's highly likely that it hasn't gone to Xero and there's an issue with it. And it just makes it so much easier. So don't go and put your same prefix like INV in here. It becomes very, very confusing.
Great bit of advice.
Yeah. Let's have a look at cancelling and deleting invoices. So if I go back to my invoice, we've got our options button up here. So if I cancel my invoice, why have I not got oh, because it's paid. I'm just going to remove my payment, otherwise I can't cancel it, which makes sense. Now, choosing between delete or cancel is important. If you cancel it, at least you have an audit trail in Workflow Max and you get a void in Xero. So as I just kind of intimated, if there's a payment against the invoice, it won't let you do it. It will say, I've got a payment, not allowed to cancel. Now I've got the cancel invoice option. So if I cancel that, now I'm assuming that delete of payment will also delete in Xero. So we'll see.
Crossy
Nothing like
fingers.
live testing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now on my job, that number is now cancelled. Now if I go into this one now,
We can see the whole word cancelled now, which we didn't used to be able to either as well.
yes, true. So now can you see my invoice is now voided? So I removed that payment from Workflow Max. It immediately removed it from Xero. I cancelled it. It voided it in Xero. So in Xero, you can never reuse that invoice number. So the next time you create an invoice, it will go to Xero and collect the next number. So that's a good thing to bear in mind. If you delete your invoice, it will remove it from Workflow Max without a trace, and it will not void it in Xero. So best practice generally is cancelling. It just keeps two systems completely in sync. The other slightly contrived thing to mention is if your numbering sequence is Workflow Max, I have had clients that have deleted an invoice and they don't want a gap in their numbering, so they go to the numbering sequence and put the next number as the one that they've just used. Then they try and sync another invoice, and Xero will not have it because it has used that invoice number. You cannot have the same invoice number again. So I know that's kind of tinkering with settings, but that is
Still a good point to know. Yep.
Yeah. So that's how we deal with when our invoices go over. So the other thing that is very common to do is creating credit notes. So what happens with credit notes? Where do they go? And what actions happen? So if we let's create another invoice just so that we can credit note it. I use the same job. For this one, I'll build the rest of the 1350 on that.
Very good.
There's a bit of a delay on this screen, isn't there? For ding.
Comes and goes, I think.
Yeah, it does. There's my 1350. I'm happy with that. Save and approve. Off that goes to Xero. That'll be in my drafts pile. Let's just pull that up so we've got it. I could have gone to draft. There we are, 1620 with VAT. Let's get rid of that. Now I need a credit note because we've made a mistake. We need to refund some money to the client. So if I go back to my job, I'm going to have to create a credit note against here. So I'll do another progress invoice. And it's going to be an actual invoice. So credit notes don't really exist in workflow. You have to create a negative sales invoice, essentially. So here, if you have any costs already on the invoice, unselect those with your bulk unselect.
In one go.
In one go. Add your cost. So I'm just going to call this client refund. In your quantity field, make sure you put -1. Unit cost, I'm going to leave blank, but the price is the amount I wish to credit. Let's say I'm doing the full amount, 1350. Save and add. So that will essentially create my negative invoice, 1350, with my negative VAT. Save and approve that. Now that one will go to Xero. So that should come across as a credit note. So I'll have a CN as a prefix. There we are, 1504. Sorry, are you going to say something?
No, that was just, there it is. Yeah.
Oh, yep, there it is. Yep. So the first thing I'm going to do in Xero, I didn't approve that. I'm going to approve both of these. So approve my invoice first. Now, if I go to approve my credit note, now, at the point of approving the credit note, it's going to ask me which invoice would I like to allocate the credit to. So it's already picked up. I've got an exact match of 1503. So let's say 1620. So that allocates my credit. So Xero is correct. So my payment, my credit has been allocated against my invoice. If I now go back to invoices, have a look at my original invoice, that will have the payment against it. 1503. So that is now marked as paid. However, my credit note doesn't get marked as paid. So that's the bit you have to do. So if I search for CN, it should be in here somewhere.
You might need to go to the job to find it.
Yeah, 1504. Let's try 1504. You think it won't show up in this list, possibly? There he is. Yeah.
Found it. There we go.
Yeah. So if I open my credit note, you will see that there is no payment against it. So you won't want this hanging around as an unpaid item. So you will need to go and manually mark that as paid. So add my payment there.
Greater than or equal to 0.
Usually
No.
that works fine. because I don't
We
want to
have
put a,
by the onion.
or I'll tell you what we'll do instead. If I go back to my list, and will it just let me mark as paid?
You can write off the balance.
I could do, yeah. Or maybe I can just do this, mark as paid.
Hey, let's see if it does.
There we are. So let me do it that way. So it's
So we do.
not interested in the amount. So that's how we
Good.
handle credit notes to keep both our systems in sync. Otherwise, you can get into a bit of a tangle, can't you?
Certainly true.
So that's our invoices side. Now, the other thing we need to keep an eye on is the export screen. Actually, we'll go and do troubleshooting on both purchase and sales in a moment, but this is the area in our failed box where any sync errors with Xero are going to appear. But let's go and handle our purchases and we'll come back to both sync logs. So when we receive a supplier bill, that's the point where we want to send a bill to pay to Xero. So if I have here's my PO here, it's issued. Let's say I receive my bill. So I just want to add a bill to this one. There's my invoice ID that supplier has sent me. Let's say we just received the whole lot. There's my bill. Click save. At the point of clicking save, that one will go over to Xero. And then similarly to the invoices, that will be in bills to pay. Mine are all in draft, I believe. I think that was it. Who was my supplier? Ace Builders. It's still going over. So the bill to pay will land in Xero. It will, in the same way as the sales invoices, it's going to be pulling out that cost of that account code. So whether you're using an override or your standard settings, it's going to appear in there along with any tracking categories. We should just mention, although it's a topic in itself, if you wanted to use an add-on for purchase orders, you could consider Easy Bills, which is a way to automate the sending the supplier invoices into Workflow Max as POs, much like Dext. In fact, very similar to the Dext integration. So we haven't got time to delve into that today, but that's a good add-on to use.
Easy Bills has the benefit of also being able to send across to Xero at the same time, which is quite a game changer. So we'll hopefully be able to bring you some details of that on another occasion. But yes, it's quite exciting.
Yeah. With payments on supplier bills, they do not feature in Workflow Max at all. So when you pay your supplier in Xero, that payment does not come back to Workflow. So the payments, the back and forth of payments only applies to the sales invoices, which we said you can do either from Workflow or from Xero, which is quite nice. So there's going to be a bit of troubleshooting sometimes when things don't sync properly. So both the purchase order manager, and I'll open this up in a separate tab so we can see it side by side. The invoice screen also has any exports. So you really ought to keep an eye on this because it will tell you any that have failed. So if I hover over one of my failed ones, usually it's because of a tax rate. There we are. This one will be a tax rate that I'm using an incorrect tax rate. A very common issue, although becoming far less common now, is that people are using sales purchase tax rates for sales invoices. So here's a great example. This is a sales invoice for some services, but I've used the wrong tax rate. I've used the expenses tax rate, which Xero will quickly kick back and say, no, thank you very much. That doesn't work. So what do you do with that invoice? That goes back to what's our process for tidying this up. So you can either cancel or delete the invoice. There's nothing to do in Xero because it didn't get there, but I still think best practice is cancelling it because you'll have a record then, and then recreate your invoice and correct the tax rates.
Yeah.
There's a handy button on there. If I pick up an invoice, one of my old draft ones. For example, this one, where, no, that's not a draft one. Let me just pick up a draft that has one of those incorrect tax rates, maybe one that's been struck through. Cardiff Council.
We had something from 2023, didn't we?
Yeah, there we are. So becoming far less common now. This did come from older invoices from Workflow Max 1, but you may have this issue where you've got a strike through tax rate. So this is obviously that we're not using the proper Xero tax rate. If I had a whole stack of these, far easier to use your options button and reset your tax rates. So it will default to the one that you set up in your blanket settings in Xero. So just update everything to the proper tax rate before you click approve. So I think with the new system, you do have to be a bit more on the ball with the tax rates, but the advantage is that everything is treated in a proper way with regarding tax now. So that has updated my tax rate correctly. So I could go and approve that one now. What other invoices, what other problems have you had, David? Empty line items
Archive
in
contacts
invoices?
is another common one. Yes. So
Yeah. So I haven't got any in here, but you might see it didn't get to Xero. When you hover over it, said this contact has been archived in Xero. So you might have noticed that in your client list, if I go and look at Ultra Running or Brightside Studios, I can go and if I go to client actions, that one hasn't actually got a client in Xero. If I go to Ultra Running, client actions, view in Xero, so that will take you to the Xero client. And if it is archived, it will show as archived, and then you can unarchive the client.
Yeah,
that will be one reason. We have seen other cases where it isn't archived, but it's still not going over. There is a workaround. There's a good support note on how to handle that, but yeah, just bear in mind if you do get that, you may need to drop support a line. It's basically the link is lost between workflow and Xero, that's all. Similarly with your POs, there's also an export area. So definitely keep an eye on those because you do want all your bills to go to Xero. So there are a variety of different ways that these can not be able to sync. Must be specified. This is an empty line items one. So for whatever reason, you may have a bill that has nothing in it. Very unusual, but I don't know. There are literally no line items.
I would imagine something that was a mistake.
Yeah, human error. They tend to be the tax rate issues. It's usually the wrong tax rate has been used. So exactly the same process with these. You would typically delete the supplier bill and then redo it, wouldn't you? You're having to receipt in the PO.
Unfortunately, I was going to say that if you go into a supplier bill, it's not easy to delete them. There's the problem. And it has a lot of issues where you've got to maybe delete and reissue the purchase order. So I know that this is an area that is undergoing change at the minute, but right now it is the watchword is caution. Be careful when you're adding your bills. Make sure you've got it right before you click approve. But yeah.
Bill undoing is definitely on its way. I've been told that is under development. So you could have several bills and you could remove one bill, which would essentially iron out this process. But at the moment, I think what people tend to do is just go and add the bill into Xero because you've got it on your job because you've receipted it in via the PA. It just didn't make it to Xero. We should mention premium. I think you touched on it, didn't you? So if you were yeah, just briefly before we wrap up. So if I wanted to create my invoices in Xero, I've got clients who do that just because they prefer Xero invoicing, but other clients do it because they have recurring invoices. So if I go into an invoice, the two things that you need to be wary of is this client must exactly match the client in workflow, and there must be a link between them. and the reference field. So in this reference field, you're either going to put the job number, or you can, if I go to my job, you can use the client order number field. So it depends what you prefer. Either will work, it doesn't matter. It also depends what your client wants to see on the invoice. That probably dictates it. Most of my clients use the client order number field because they'll have some kind of numbering system that they'll put here that isn't necessarily a PO number. It's maybe a project manager and then maybe the job number. But anything you put in here, this maps to the reference field. So these two items must match, otherwise it won't find itself to the job in workflow.
Yeah.
It works
Another
really
reason,
well as long
oh,
as
it
those two are
does.
correct. Yeah.
Another reason that you might want to use the client order number as opposed to the job number is if you're using recurring jobs in Workflow Max, is that you can state a client number to repeat on the new job when it comes up. So
Good point.
essentially, you've always got that reference in the latest job so that the invoice can find it.
Yeah. And then the last bit of that puzzle is just make sure you set up your Xero integration settings correctly. I don't particularly like it creating new jobs. I think that's you know, your job, you always create your jobs in workflow first. So yeah, just be aware of that. And I often have a control report where I just check, are there any invoices that have come over that actually didn't make it to jobs? So you might want to have a custom report there that just checks. So in that custom report, you're just looking for invoices that don't have a job number. That's all you're looking for.
Miscellaneous
And then
invoices
you
are.
need to go and fix them, which means
Yes.
troubleshooting in Xero. Why doesn't this match? Do these two things match? Usually it's a typo. That's all it is. And then as soon as you resave the invoice, it will send it over to workflow again. But remember to delete that invoice, that first one that didn't make it to the job, delete it first. Otherwise, it won't go over again.
Fantastic stuff.
Good,
Well, guess
good.
what?
Now I think
Pretty
we're
much
bang on
bang on
time.
time. Yes, I
Minute
was going to
over.
say. So, yes, well done.
Yeah.
I hope you found that useful, folks, apart from me occasionally coughing my lungs up. But certainly, this is an area that you can get a lot of benefit out of. You can certainly
Yeah.
provide yourself with a lot of automation using this process. And it
Yeah.
just means that your systems are in sync. So, certainly, if you have questions, you can either reach out to the support team or again, you can reach out to your friendly neighborhood advisor, and we would be very happy to assist. Thank you
We
again,
will.
Liz, for all the work on
Thank
that.
you.
And thank you again to the team in the background, Kaya and Linnell. Thank you very much. And we'll see you all again next week.
Okay. Have a good day, folks. Or
see you,
not.
folks.
Bye.